Well, welcome. I'm Leslie Touma, the Executive Director of the American Task Force for Lebanon. We're a nonprofit headquartered in Washington, and our mission is the strengthening of the U.S.-Lebanon relationship. And one of the priorities in our organization is broadening support for Lebanon's ability to cope with the enormous number of Syrian refugees. And in that regard, we've done two things this year. First, we were very privileged to honor Sheikha Rimal al-Sabah, who's a Goodwill Ambassador to the UNHCR, and at our annual gala. So she was instrumental in highlighting the issue to a great audience of sold-out capacity. And so it was a great venue to showcase her critical work. And today we're really privileged to have Jana Mason. She's the Senior Advisor for External and Government Relations at UNHCR here in Washington. She's got an extensive background in refugees, the international refugee community, the U.S. Refugee Agency, a long history. She's done a master's at University of Virginia and has a law degree from Georgetown University. So this is, as I have been telling you, an issue of enormous interest to our members, and this is our first Facebook Live opportunity to broaden our ability to bring them expert opinions and information about one of our priorities for the organization. So welcome.
Thank you, Leslie. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly a pleasure to join you for your first Facebook Live. I hope it's the first of what will be many, because I know this is the way a lot of people get informed these days, so I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So we've heard a lot about statistics, and I thought we've heard a lot about the lost generation, education, that Lebanon, almost a third of the country is now contains Syrian refugees, and most of them are women and children. So I just wonder if you could, speak a little bit to the demographics and maybe the location of where the refugees are.
Yeah, thanks. When we talk about refugees, we hate to always talk about numbers, because we try to remind people that behind every number is a person, like you said, increasingly a woman or a child. But particularly in this situation, you really have to start with the numbers, because the magnitude of the issue facing Lebanon really isn't clear until you talk about the numbers. So in that respect, let me start by giving one big piece of information, which some viewers may be familiar with, which is that Lebanon is currently the largest per capita refugee hosting country in the world. It's one of the largest even in terms of actual numbers, but on a per capita basis, it's clearly the largest. And that's in part because of Lebanon's size. It is a small country, but also because of the number of Syrian refugees in the country. The government estimates that there are 1.5 million Syrians. Of those registered by UNHCR, we've registered well over 1 million. So when you talk about 1 million people in a country that had, how many people before the Syrian conflict? 4 million?
4 million.
You are talking about a situation where at least 1 out of every 4 Lebanese, if not more, people in Lebanon now is a Syrian refugee. And we should also mention, maybe the numbers are smaller, but there are at least 20,000, 21,000 non-Syrian registered refugees still in Lebanon, mostly Iraqis who were there since the initial Iraq conflict, and of course some are still coming now. But there are also Sudanese, Ethiopians, others in Lebanon as well. And this, of course, is not even considering the, what's the number? 250,000, 500,000 almost, Palestinians, 400 and some thousand Palestinians. I should mention, just in case there's any confusion, that my agency, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, does not have a mandate for the Palestinian refugees in this region of the world. There's another UN agency, UNRWA, that's probably very familiar to ATFL members. UNRWA has a mandate for Palestinians in that region, so we, as we do elsewhere in the world, we lead the international response for all other refugees. So in that context, we have registered over 1 million. As you mentioned, most of them are women and children. Over 80% of the registered Syrian refugees in Lebanon are women and children, and over half, I think 55%, are children under age 18. And I've been surprised when I visited there how many are very young children. I think something like 18% are under age 5. So as with any refugee situation, it's largely a women and children's crisis, particularly a children's crisis, and Lebanon is no exception. About a quarter are adult women, less than 20% are adult men. So largely women and children, and they are currently residing in, well, they're all over Lebanon. They're formally in, I think we've counted over 1,700 locations around the country. About a quarter are in the Mount Lebanon area. Another quarter or so are in the Bekaa. But the last I heard, I think about 15% are in the north, and even 7% are in the south, and that surprises a lot of people, but about 7% are in the south. And the rest are in different areas, the northeast and such. In part because of Lebanon being so small, and because large parts of land are just not available for something like a big refugee camp, they are spread out, and there are no formal refugee camps in Lebanon. This is something to note because some people are very familiar with the Syrian refugee situation in Jordan, for example, where even though most refugees there are not in camps, there are still 2 big refugee camps that a lot of the media has visited, a lot of people have visited. So when they come to Lebanon, people say, well, where are the formal camps? There are no camps. Again, in part because of land issues, and in part because the Lebanese government made it very clear from the beginning of the crisis that they didn't want to establish formal camps. I think this was in part a reaction to the long-standing Palestinian camps that are in the country, but also because the focus from the beginning was to not create a permanent infrastructure for the refugees, instead to facilitate their eventual return. So there are no formal camps. But any visitor to Lebanon does see what could be mistaken maybe for a camp. We call these informal tented settlements. They're, again, all over Lebanon, but only about 17% of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon are in these informal tented settlements. Over 80% of the refugees, the Syrian refugees, are renting accommodations. These are usually apartments, usually substandard apartments, often overcrowded. They're living with other Syrian refugee families. 17%, like I said, are in the informal settlements. Some of those settlements were there even before the conflict, because there were hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000 Syrian agricultural workers in Lebanon even before the Syrian current war, and a lot of them were in the Bekaa in agricultural camps. So a lot of their relatives and new arrivals went to live in these settlements as well, and then others have popped up all over the country. It's important to explain they're not formal, because when UNHCR or partners run a refugee camp, there are certain international standards we adhere to in terms of how much space each person needs, how much water you provide, sanitation, making sure that schools are built and such. Since these are not formal camps that we are running or managing, they're unfortunately below what we would call what we would consider minimum standards for a refugee camp. The conditions are fairly poor. We're doing what we can to try to improve them. Our staff go throughout Lebanon, and when they see one of these informal camps, we try to provide assistance. Sometimes it's handing out blankets. We have also provided materials, particularly in the winter, to help these people brace against the difficult conditions. We sometimes have actually put in, with partners, latrines and other sanitation systems. So we do try to improve them, but they're all over Lebanon.
Is there any way to know an estimate on the numbers in the informal tented communities?
Well, it would be 17% of over a million
Over a million,
people.
okay.
And again, the numbers do change daily. A lot of these informal settlements are in areas that are prone to flooding or to fire. So sometimes people very quickly have to relocate. Sometimes a new settlement will pop up. One of the unfortunate things we've seen recently is that some Syrians are being either formally or informally evicted from where they're living, either because of community tensions or other situations. So some people become essentially homeless very, very quickly and maybe have to live in one of these informal settlements. And again, from what I saw, some of them were in actual tents. Some of them were in buildings where they were made out of plywood. I saw one family living under a billboard that they had pulled down. So these clearly are not ideal. Again, most are renting apartments, but the conditions even there are not good. The other few percent are living in a range of what we would call informal shelter. Some of them are in unused buildings or unfinished buildings that you see around Lebanon. Some are basically squatting on land. Some are in unused sports facilities, churches, mosques, even animal shelters. So these conditions are very difficult, and again, we do what we can to help make improvements to these properties. We give what we call sealing off kits to help seal off unfinished buildings from the elements, particularly during winter. So shelter is clearly a big issue in Lebanon. But again, they're literally, the refugees are all over the country. Most of them probably are hidden from view because they're in apartments or other rental situations.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've also had a number of questions about education, and that over 50% of these refugees are not in school. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but also, why aren't they in school? That we understand that, their parents are aware they could go to school, but sometimes they're forced to work, and maybe just some of the detail.
Absolutely. I mean, Lebanon very generously has allowed children to access the school system. And Syrian refugee children have access both to the day and afternoon, the morning and afternoon shifts in Lebanese schools. And some of them are taking advantage of that and are going to school. And we encourage that and try to facilitate that as much as possible. We will help, UNHCR helps pay the cost of school fees, and we and our partners will pay some of the other less formal fees that are associated with going to school, and will sometimes help try to arrange or pay for transportation or other materials as well. As you mentioned, however, roughly half of the school-aged kids, Syrian refugee children in Lebanon, are not in school. And this is due to a number of factors. One of them is simply that it's been difficult for them to try to keep up. It is a different curriculum than they were used to in Syria. In some cases, it's taught in different languages. The Syrian children are educated only in Arabic in Syria. In Lebanon, of course, schooling is in Arabic, but also in English and in French, depending on the institution and the class. So the language and the curriculum have been an adjustment. And also, we need to keep in mind that many of these Syrian children were out of school in Syria for a period of time before they arrived in Lebanon because of the war and the devastation, and because many Syrians were internally displaced inside Syria before they made the decision to cross an international border and become a refugee. So they were often out of school even before they arrived, and once they do arrive, it takes a while for the family to get settled and for them to even realize that they may be able to go to school. So making up for those missing years of education would be a challenge for any child. And then when you add the fact that it's a different curriculum, sometimes a different language, that's a challenge as well. In addition to those challenges, as you mentioned, many Syrian families have unfortunately needed to rely on their children to work, and we can talk a bit more about why this is, but they've needed to rely on their children, particularly older children, to work in what is often very difficult and dangerous conditions, and sometimes to beg on the streets. They've needed this in order to supplement the family's income. So a reliance on child labor, again, is something that we're trying, we and our partners are trying very much to work against. But the reality of child labor means that some of these kids aren't in school. And then one final reason why many might not be in school is because they sometimes are subject to some harassment, some bullying in school. I mean, this is a situation you'll find anywhere in the world where there's just a lack of full understanding and awareness of who these kids are, even though they're coming from the country next door. They're clearly not Lebanese, and like children anywhere in school, they can be subject to harassment and bullying. So some children, even if they can financially go to school and logistically can get there and they're not needed to work, some of them have had a difficult time and they're no longer attending. So to remedy that, we and our partners, in addition to trying to encourage formal schooling whenever possible, we work to try to facilitate non-formal education settings. Sometimes there are gatherings and clubs where kids can come and try to get less formal education. We call them catch-up centers to try to help make up for some of the missing years. We also have helped establish homework groups, homework support groups where kids can get a little extra support. So informal education is important, but the ideal is that they can access the formal education system, and that's what we continue to try to support.
Okay, thank you. Now, related to that and kind of the financial support, could you just give us an idea of the process? Like, once you register a family, or how does that work in terms of the financial support they're given, and how do they receive that support?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just start by just mentioning what UNHCR's role is in any refugee situation. We are the UN Refugee Agency. We were created in 1950, right after World War II, to find solutions to people displaced as a result of that war. And then a year later, the international community adopted the 1951 Convention on Refugees. And we are actually mentioned in the convention. Governments are required to cooperate with UNHCR in our job of making sure that the convention obligations are adhered to. Now, Lebanon is not a party to the convention, but the key obligation under that convention is something, it's a French term called non-refoulement. A lot of ATFL members may be familiar with it. It basically means a prohibition against forced return of refugees. Refugees are people who have crossed an international border and they can't go home because they fear persecution on one of 5 grounds. One of those is political opinion, another is religion, membership in a particular social group. People fleeing Syria clearly would qualify, the vast majority would qualify as refugees on one of those grounds. So when a country encounters refugees on their territory, they can't send them back to their home country. The convention doesn't require them to grant them citizenship or permanent residence. It just says while they fear persecution back home, they can't be returned there. Now, this prohibition is generally regarded to be what we call customary international law, meaning it's binding on all states, all governments, even if they're not a party to the convention. And Lebanon does acknowledge that and has come out and said that they're committed to the principle of non-refoulement. So despite a lot of the challenges that we are talking about and will continue to talk about, one thing that we haven't really had to worry too much about is that Lebanon would forcibly return people. So our role from the beginning of the crisis has been first to register people. We view registration not just as a paperwork exercise, but actually as the first step in providing protection and assistance. In order to assist people, you need to know who they are, where they're located, what the family composition is like, and any particular vulnerabilities they might have, medical needs, mental health needs, other situations as well. So since the beginning of the conflict, we have registered people, and registration is the first step then in giving them a UNHCR, some sort of a documentation that recognizes that they're known to UNHCR, they are considered a refugee. This is a situation where, because the numbers are so large, we're not interviewing each person individually to make sure they qualify as refugees. It's largely what we would call a prima facie refugee situation, because we know why they're fleeing. But we have been registering, and then once we register them, again, we provide a full range of assistance. I can talk a little bit more about it. Again, we're not running camps, but since this is largely what we call an urban refugee situation, we do everything from counseling them on documentation requirements, legal rights and obligations, to providing psychosocial support, counseling. Again, I mentioned some of the informal education. We're very concerned with protection against gender-based violence, so we have safe spaces for women, for children, access to the health center. We can talk about health, but that's a big part of the work that we're doing. But also, and I think you were alluding to this, a big part of our assistance in Lebanon is cash assistance. Most of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon are quite vulnerable when it comes to their economic well-being. 70% are below the national poverty line, and 55% are below the extreme poverty line. So we're talking about a population, for various reasons, that is very economically at risk. Now, because of funding limitations, we certainly can't provide for the full financial needs of all the refugees. We focus on those that we consider to be the most vulnerable among the vulnerable. We and other partners have developed a tool to help us identify individuals and families with particular vulnerabilities, again, because of medical needs, or because maybe it's a female-headed household with many young children, no means of support. When we identify these particularly vulnerable people, we do provide cash assistance. Even in countries where there are camps, again, in most places in the world, most refugees aren't in camps. So urban assistance and cash assistance has become a big part of what we do. And we find that it's a way to help people regain some dignity over their lives by, instead of just handing them items that they need, allowing them to make decisions for their own families. So we do this through means of an ATM card, where the adults in the household, usually the woman often heading a household, can go and buy what she needs for herself and her family. The World Food Program, which is another of our big partners, provides cash assistance as well through another e-card to help refugees provide for their food needs. They can use that card to go to local shops, groceries, buy the food that they need. So cash assistance is a big part of our assistance to the refugees, but again, because of funding limits, we can really only target it to the most vulnerable among the refugees, all of whom are by definition vulnerable, but unfortunately we have to be very selective in who we can provide cash assistance to.
Is there a per diem estimate that people could be aware of, or
it's
is it
based on the particular vulnerabilities,
Okay.
and it's based on number of people in the family. I at one point saw that it was the equivalent of maybe like $130 a month. It's not a tremendous amount of money. We have a special cash assistance that can help if an individual or family has been subject to specific protection concerns, like if the person has been a victim of sexual and gender-based violence, or if they have severe needs of other sorts where an infusion of cash would help them relocate to another area. For example, if they've been evicted, and if they need to, they have needs beyond just the normal food and other assistance. So we have protection-related cash, and then we have the regular cash. I should say that because of the conditions people are living in, which we discussed, winters are particularly harsh and particularly challenging for refugees, particularly the ones living in the tented settlements or unfinished buildings. So in addition to blankets and sometimes cooking stoves and sealing off kits, we do provide an infusion of cash for certain refugees to help them get through the winter, purchase fuel, purchase other items that they need. So during the winter months, the cash assistance may be a little more for some of the families.
Okay. And then a huge topic for our audience is host community, tension and the needs of the Lebanese themselves in terms of infrastructure, and maybe you could address that.
Absolutely, and this really goes to one of the issues you've alluded to, which is the refugees themselves and whether they're able to care for themselves. I mentioned that the kids can legally go to school, even though there are challenges and over half aren't in school. I mentioned the difficult shelter situations I mentioned the poverty status of the Syrian refugees. And a lot of this is connected. All these issues are interconnected. And the other big issue they're connected to is the employment situation, which you also referenced. Syrian refugees, because of their long history with Lebanon and a history of cross-border movements, have traditionally worked in Lebanon. Many of them, as I mentioned earlier, were working as agricultural workers even before the Syrian conflict. But through tradition, and I think it's even mentioned in law, Syrian refugees can legally work in 3 sectors, which is agriculture, the service sector, largely, I think it's called economy, but it's largely service industry jobs, and maybe to a lesser extent construction. Even in these 3 areas, work permits are often required, usually required to work legally, and these permits are often hard to get. It requires the cooperation of an employer. There are certain funds that have to be paid, and it's often just too complicated or too costly for people to get formal work permits. So most Syrian refugees in Lebanon who are working are doing so in the informal sector, working illegally, basically. And even though this does help provide for some of their needs, informal, illegal employment is never a viable solution, either in Lebanon or in any other country. Not only because the wages usually aren't sufficient, but because they don't get the labor market protections, legal protections that employers are required to adhere to if they're giving them a work permit. So many refugees, again, do work in the informal sector, but even this creates tensions. I know that there's a big perception in Lebanon, as there are just about anywhere in the world where there's a refugee situation. There's a perception that refugees are competing for jobs. And in the case of lower skilled, poor Lebanese who themselves are struggling to find employment, it's understandable that they would look at the wave of Syrians who has come to their country and see this as creating competition. And to some extent, there may actually be some competition. I am aware, though, that a lot of the same sectors the refugees are working in, even informally, are not always those that some of the lower income Lebanese are working in. For example, small shops and driving taxis and a few others. It's not necessarily an equal match in terms of Syrians and Lebanese. So the extent to which there is actual competition may be overestimated by a lot of people, and it becomes more of a perception than a reality. But nevertheless, I don't think we need to underestimate the extent to which tensions are real, and there's a real basis for this feeling in Lebanon. I started off by mentioning that Lebanon is the largest per capita refugee hosting country in the world. With these numbers, it would be unthinkable that there wouldn't be a significant host country, host community impact. And this impact is definitely being felt in Lebanon. Anyone who travels there, whether you're there on refugee business or not, can hear the discussions, can follow social media, can almost feel it in the air, just the impact that the Syrian crisis is having, both politically, security-wise, and certainly in terms of access to services, to jobs, to housing. The community is feeling the strain, and that's why a major focus of my organization and our partners, and when I say partners, I keep saying that because my agency certainly can't do what we do alone. We do a lot. We work throughout Lebanon. We have 6 offices around the country. We have over 600 staff. But with over 1 million refugees, we need a lot of partners. So we work very closely with, I already mentioned, the World Food Program, also UNICEF, the UN Development Program, as well as a lot of non-governmental organizations, both international, national, and then of course our government partners in Lebanon, the frontline ministries, the Prime Minister's office, and others. So we work with these partners in a concerted effort, and in the past few years it's become much more organized and much more deliberate, an effort to ameliorate the impact on Lebanon as a country, and particularly at the local community level where the impact is felt. Again, because refugees largely are they're in every area of the country, and because they're not in formal camps, and they're largely in urban areas, renting apartments. They impact the health sector, the education sector. Water and sanitation has become an issue, certainly the employment sector. So one of the most recent developments, and Lebanon is a great example of this, has been that we're working with the World Bank and other international financial institutions, and more closely with the development sector, to really address the host community impact. We've been doing some of this since the beginning of the crisis. We haven't only helped refugees. We've done some infrastructure projects and other forms of assistance that benefit Lebanese themselves. But now, in the past couple of years, this has been a much larger effort. So, for example, the World Bank has now started making concessional loans available to countries like Lebanon that are middle-income countries and would not previously have qualified for these loans. Now, of course, no country wants to take a loan just to help refugees, but these are very low interest rates at very favorable conditions, long repayment, and some of it can be used for things that will actually benefit Lebanon in the long run as well. We, UNHCR, is also providing some direct assistance to the various ministries in Lebanon to help them with staffing needs, with training, with equipment, supplies. The education ministry, for example, we're helping them hire teachers and get supplies and even train teachers. We're also helping with a number of infrastructure projects around Lebanon, public works projects, and even rehabilitating schools, for example, to talk about education as well. We know that Lebanon and other neighboring countries are bearing the brunt of the Syrian refugee crisis. There's a lot of attention to Syrians being resettled in the U.S. or other Western countries. There was a lot of attention a couple of years ago, last year, to refugees going into Europe. But the vast majority, over 5 million Syrian refugees, are still in the Syria region, including Lebanon. So clearly Lebanon and its neighbors are bearing the brunt of this crisis, feeling the strains, feeling the tensions, and that's why we're making a concerted effort not only to assist the Syrians in Lebanon, but to assist the Lebanese government and the Lebanese people. They've been incredibly generous. We want them to keep being generous, and we can only assure that by helping them as well.
Excellent. In a related issue, I know that have been informed that UNHCR was part of the group documenting the return of the Syrian refugees, about 60 recently, to Arsal. And maybe you could talk a little bit about, the path forward, or the, what do you see if there was eventually a return? What's the mechanism for managing that?
Absolutely. In any refugee situation, we work to try to pursue what's become known as 3 durable solutions. The first durable solution is return. This is clearly the solution of choice, not just for the international community, but for the refugees themselves. And we have, both in Lebanon and in other neighboring countries, we've done surveys, focus groups of refugees to try to get information on their intentions, what they see as their own future. And overwhelmingly, something like 90% of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon want to go home. It was probably closer to 100% at the beginning of the crisis, but still now, in its 7th year, it's still about 90%. Despite a lot of people thinking all refugees want to be resettled or want to come to the West, Europe, US, they don't. They want to go home where they have their culture, their extended families are still there, their property, their identity. They want to go home. And so this is the first solution. But return home under international standards has to be voluntary. Again, the Refugee Convention says you can't force people to go back. And it needs to be in what we call safety and dignity. So since the beginning of the conflict, we have been thinking about and preparing for and laying the groundwork for return, knowing not only that that's what refugees want, but that's clearly the only long-term solution, because the other solutions, permanent integration in the host country or resettlement to another country, just isn't viable. Permanent integration, because, as we've discussed, Lebanon is so small, has its own political and economic challenges, can't absorb 1 million refugees permanently. And third country resettlement is a great solution for a very small number of people. The numbers just aren't there. And any year, less than 1% of refugees get resettled. So return home is the only solution, ultimately, for the refugee population. But it has to be voluntary. And we know that despite the fact that there are occasional returns to Syria, people do go back to some areas that are viewed as more safe than others. Sometimes they go back to check on property or family members. So there have been some spontaneous returns that we monitor, but we don't encourage them, we don't facilitate them, because in our view, conditions are not yet ripe for return. That being said, and while we're all hoping for and awaiting a political solution in Syria, we're not going to wait until that day to start thinking about returns. My agency and our partners, in addition to working throughout Lebanon, we work inside Syria. We were there before the conflict, helping Iraqi refugees and others. We're there now helping internally displaced Syrians and others at need throughout the country. Obviously, there are some parts of Syria that we don't currently have access to, but we are in just about every government in Syria. And in addition to the day-to-day assistance that we're providing, we're also keeping an eye on making things conducive for eventual returns. It's not easy, obviously, when you're working in a war zone, but to give you one example, when there are areas that maybe were held by ISIS or others, and those areas are cleared, we and our partners start looking at what kind of shelter conditions will be needed for people to go home. Security is the biggest factor, refugees tell us, about whether they can go home. But beyond security, they have to have something to go home to. A lot of anybody who's seen pictures of the devastation in Syria knows that right now, in many parts of the country, there's not much to go home to. So starting to look at, putting back in basic supplies, basic infrastructure, so that people can go home is something we're starting to look at. Obviously, we need to make sure it's in an area that is likely to continue to be safe so that it won't be destroyed again, but also starting to look at other things that can be done. And some of those things can be done in Lebanon and other host countries. That's why documentation is so important. We work to try to help make sure that refugees can register births, register marriages, get other civil documentation. It's challenging in Lebanon. It's a complicated process and an expensive process, but birth and marriage registration is important because people will need this when they go back to Syria. That's why education and livelihoods are so important, because to avoid the lost generation that you talked about at the beginning, we want to make sure that people stay engaged mentally, physically, that they keep up with their education, that they keep up with skills training, vocational training, keep up with their work skills, so that when they go back to Syria, they can rebuild the country as well. So part of what we're doing in Lebanon and part of what we're starting to do in Syria is all with an eye towards eventual return.
Very good. I think we have time just for one more question, but also as part of the kind of road forward, we're hearing a lot about donor fatigue and working with supporting refugees. Can you speak a little bit to that? And for people that want to know themselves, I mean, are there avenues for individuals to contribute to UNHCR, or just that new issue?
Well, to start with the last question, that would be easy. There's so many ways to get involved. If anybody was interested specifically in supporting UNHCR, we have a nonprofit association that supports us here in the U.S. It's called USA for UNHCR. They're at unrefugees.org. But there are many other partners, as I mentioned, UN agencies, non-governmental organizations that work in Lebanon, that work inside Syria, that are helping prepare for return as well. There are a lot of ways to get involved. Even in the U.S., volunteering to help with newly arrived resettled refugees, whether they're from Syria or elsewhere, is always a good way to get involved. Donor fatigue is a factor. It's a factor in all refugee situations. It's a factor here because, like you said, we're in the 7th year now, and funding is difficult. My agency doesn't get much. We only get about 3% of our funding from the regular UN budget. So we have to go every year hat in hand and try to raise voluntary contributions from governments. And this comes in dribs and drabs throughout the year. So, for example, right now, our Appeal for Lebanon is probably about 10% funded. By the end of any given year, we usually end up only about 60 to 70% funded. So there are a lot of gaps, which is why, for example, we have to target only the most vulnerable with cash assistance. But that's why we're also looking at some of these new solutions and new approaches. While we're planning for and working for eventual returns, we know that the strains are being felt. So the loans from the World Bank, the role of the development actors in helping benefit not only Syrians in Lebanon, but the Lebanese community, the Lebanese government as well, that's very critical. But we're also asking governments to look at new approaches. Since permanent resettlement is not always so easy, we're urging governments to make temporary work visas available, or longer-term work visas, family reunion visas, other ways to take some of the burden, some of the pressure off Lebanon. Cash assistance will always be needed. Again, the infrastructure, the development projects will always be needed. Ultimately, we don't want the Lebanese to feel that they're going to continue to bear the brunt and be left holding the bag. We want them to realize that keeping their doors open to Syrians is not against their interest, that it's not only a humane and generous thing to do, but something will come out of it that potentially will benefit Lebanon in the long run as well. I should mention, because you mentioned Arsal, I know there are a lot of concerns about security. Arsal is a bit of a concern because of its location and because of the nature of some of the issues and demographics there, but it is an exception in terms of the refugees in Lebanon. As I mentioned at the beginning, over 80% are women and children. These are people who are fleeing terrorism themselves. That's why they are refugees. Rather than staying in Syria, they voted with their feet basically, and for the protection of their families, they fled across a border. So they are fleeing the same terrorism that the international community is fighting in Syria, in Iraq, and in other parts of the world. So the issues in Arsal are real, but even there we know that some of the refugees have unfortunately been used as human shields, and they themselves are asking for protection in that area. But that is fortunately the exception, not the norm, in terms of the refugee population throughout Lebanon.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It's very informative for our readers, and we appreciate all your substantive information and really getting into the detail and facts. We will be sending out a link more broadly that includes background information and other statistics provided by UNHCR for our members. So, just again, thank you very much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.